Many years ago, I was sitting in the balcony of University Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. I had gathered with thousands of others to celebrate the life and the ministry of the Reverend Earlene Walker, whose daughter, Sarah Wilson, and family were, and many of you, some of you remember them, were in this church for many years. Sarah was, as I say, her daughter Earlene was not only a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, she was the wife of the Reverend Dr. Granville Walker, a significant figure in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the 20th century, and was the senior minister of UCC, University Christian Church, for many, many years. The church had gathered to bury not only a loved child of God, but in reality to bury royalty. Really. And when such events occur, people pull out all of the stops and they use all of the good stuff, the best stuff available, which they did. It was a magnificent service. Again, I'm in the bird's eye view up in the balcony, all of the pomp, all of the circumstance, all of the processionals, the pipe organ with Betty Bowles playing, and the chancel choir was combined with the top choir of TCU under the same direction, Dr. Ron Shirey. The anthem was in Latin, and I was absolutely eating this up. I was so beside myself, I had to scoot over. And I remember thinking to myself, how can people not experience God in this? So holy, so sacred, so rich. I felt like a kid in a fudge factory. How? But this question just didn't come to me in that moment. It was a question that was born out of a struggle. At the time, there were folk in this church who were lifting their voices asking for a different style of worship, other than traditional. And as you can imagine, there was some pushback, there was some resistance. But what might surprise you is that I was part of that resistance. I don't know if it were because I had only known traditional worship growing up, or because I do view myself in worship in many ways as a traditionalist. But I didn't think non-traditional worship would last. I thought it was a fad. But I think really, really, really down deep inside my soul, I didn't think anything outside of traditional worship was, in a word, worship. And so I had all of this going on inside of me. And I'm sitting there listening to the Reverend Dr. Joseph Jeter, who was my homiletics professor at Bright Divinity School, who was also the professor of the Granville and Earlene Walker Chair of Homiletics. And as I'm trying to listen to and take all of this in, this voice, it wasn't an audible voice, it was just a voice within my head and heart and soul that began to move me, and it said, read 1 Kings 19. I'm trying to focus here. Read 1 Kings 19. And so I reached behind or in front of like y'all have the Bibles in front of you, and I opened to 1 Kings 19. I read what we just heard this morning, the story of Elijah, and I read it, and I put it back and stuck it back in there, and now I'm focusing once again, trying to, on what Dr. Jeter is saying about this wonderful lady. And that same voice said, read it again. Now I'm sitting by my mentor, who is now looking at me like, I taught you better than this. Why are you doing Bible study in the midst of this worship service? Read it again. And so I got it out and I opened it up in 1 Kings 19 and I began to read, but I began to read it and hear it and say it in myself differently this time. It's not what was on the page. I began to read, for Elijah, God was not in the wind. For Elijah, God was not in the earthquake. For Elijah, God was not in the fire. For Elijah, God was in that sheer silence. It was in the silence for Elijah that he was able to feel God's presence, that he was able to hear God speak. He was able to hear his name called and to have that question, what are you doing here, Elijah? Well, I closed the Bible and I sat there. And I was no longer beside myself. I was by myself in the midst of thousands of people. You know, that by yourself, that vulnerable by yourself place, when we come face to face with the new truth and possibility. That humbling place that says, you know, you need to rethink this, Ben. You need to be open. That painful and prideful place that says, you know, is there anywhere inside of you that you might consider yourself to be wrong? I don't like that place. You see, the theology of both Testaments, Old and New, continually shout to us that God is always present in all things. God was in the wind. God was in the earthquake. God was in the fire, just not for Elijah. That's not where Elijah could experience God. But just because Elijah couldn't experience God in the midst of the other doesn't mean God wasn't there. If we believe God is of all things, in all things. And I realized in that moment that I needed to have some conversation with folk back home. That there was more than one way for people to experience and to know God. And we need to celebrate that this church offers different ways now to worship so that people can find their best way of experiencing God. And we need to celebrate that. You know, July was fun. It was easy, great for the staff. You know, one and done, 10 o'clock, out of here. And it was nice. It was good having more folk together. But is that really the reason for worship? To fill a room? Or to feel less empty? I don't think so. Is it worship to provide a place, a vehicle, a means to experience the holy in community? You know, this This passage here can open up so many different ways, and how we need to give thanks for diversity, and how God is in the midst of it all. We need to be willing to give space for God to work, and to give us permission to say, you know what, just because we don't experience God in other forms of worship, because I'll tell you, there are some forms of worship, there are certain theologies, certain biblical interpretations I do not experience God in at all until it's over, until the service is done. And I walk out in prayer saying, thank God. Because I certainly didn't experience God there. But that doesn't mean God wasn't there. That just means I could not connect. And we need to give permission that says that just because we don't experience God in other forms of worship or other theologies or other biblical interpretations does not mean that God cannot be experienced by others. Because how arrogant is it to think that God can only be experienced in your way or in my way of worship? Or that God can only be understood, really understood, by how you understand God or how I understand God. You know, this was one of the chief complaints that the religious folk had about Jesus. He didn't fit the mold. Jesus was saying to the religious, established people, you know, there's other ways of experiencing the holy. God can be experienced in the cowboy church, in the motorcycle church, in the traditional and non-traditional, in the denominational and non-denominational churches, in the very conservative to the very charismatic, because God meets us, and this is a take-home message, God meets us where we are and embraces us, accepting us for who we are, asking, what are you doing here? Elijah? The reason that there are certain theologies, certain styles of worship that do not speak to me at all is because that's not where I am. That's not where God greets me. It's not where I experience and can greet God. But the take-home point is how God meets us where we are. Elijah, what are you doing here? Why in the cave? Well, he was running for his life. You see, he had really upset some power. He had upset King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. There was a little dispute and competition among the prophets of Baal and Elijah, and the stories tell us that a lot of the prophets of Baal lost their life, and prophet loss did not set well with Jezebel. So she said, I'm going to kill you. He's running, and he thinks he is the only one alive, the only one that cares. And he is not in a good place. And God meets him in that place and says, what are you doing here? What got you here? You know, at times, and this is part of the good news of the God that we have, is that God continually meets us where we are, but so often God is not content leaving us where we are. God is not content leaving us in our pain. God is not content leaving us in our struggles, in our longings, in our brokenness, in our dis-ease, in our unresolved. Not because God wants us to be little compliant boys and girls, obedient people. No, it's because God wants wholeness for us. God wants goodness for us, richness for us. God wants us to be whole, and God seeks continually seeking ways to get us there, to get us out of what is holding us back, leading us. How does that psalm say? Leading us beside the still waters, restoring our soul, healing our hurts, repairing what is broken in our lives. And God uses every means available to be known by us. And isn't that really what we want in life? What we really, really want in life is to know God and to be known by God. Isn't that why you're here? Like this card asks, what are you doing here? You know, if you were greeted at the door, and some of you were with the card, it was kind of interesting to hear some of the initial responses. I won't repeat them. But I started thinking of some that might be at least thought of initially. You know, what are you doing here? Well, because my wife told me I was going to come. Or my husband said we're going. Or my partner said we're going. I'm here because I was strongly invited. Well, you know, I'm not sure. I just feel really guilty when I don't show up. Well, you know, I'm a part of a faith community, and it's very important for me to be here. Well, I have responsibility this morning. I was cooking supper, I was eating supper, I was avoiding supper, I was something about supper. The phone rang, and somebody asked me if I'd be interested in to serve this or do that, and I was in a weak moment. I said yes, and I'm a person of my word, and so I'm here because my name's on the list. Well, I like to eat, and my income requires me to be here on Sunday. Many of you know my vacation was over, so that's why I'm here. Yeah, we have all of that. We do. We have all of that. But why are you really, really, and why are we really, really here? Why do you come to worship? I mean, there's other things we could be doing right now. Some very worthwhile things we could be doing right now. But isn't it so that we can be touched by God? As scary as that can sound. That we can be noticed by God, that we can hear our name called by God. Isn't it to hear what God is trying to say to us? Isn't it to know that we are heard by God in our earnest prayers, that God indeed meets us time and time again, meets us and greets us where we are, leading us where God hopes that we can be? Isn't that why we're here? To know that we are loved and forgiven and accepted and understood by God. Isn't it to touch and to be touched by God, to the holy, the sacred, whatever terms you wish to use? Isn't that why you're here? to know and to be known by God. I invite you to consider that this week. I really do. Fill out the card or make one of your own. Put it where you can see it. It may cause you to want to come back next week, to once again be reminded, to once again hear, to once again receive, to once again give, to once again know that God will greet us and meet us where we are.